It turns out we find a certain portion, maybe about a third of typically developing kids use media for this sort of sensory curation to help kind of regulate their sensory experience. But when it comes to neurodivergent kids, those kids, it was more like 45%. So
Oh.
they really use media to help manage their sensory regulation.
Welcome to the Healthy Screen Habits Podcast. I'm Hillary Wilkinson. Whether you're starting your parenting journey with a newborn or looking to connect with your teen on technology, let's learn some new healthy screen habits together. Today's guest is an expert in the relationships families have with media. As the Richard Cole Imminent Professor in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, she studies children and media in a family context. Recently, she's focused on children's use of media devices and content for sensory regulation and how this is connected with parent-child conflict around the child's media use. So I was introduced to her work during a talk on neurodivergent children and considerations surrounding screen use. And that, along with many other things, is what I'm hoping to dive into today. Welcome to Healthy Screen Habits, Dr. Kris Harrison.
Thank you so much, Hillary. It's great to be here.
Great. So, Kris, as an educator, I'm sure you understand my sort of need and want to start at a very foundational level of what we're talking about so that we can all understand sort of the language that we're using on this important topic. Can you define what is meant by that term neurodivergent?
Yeah, absolutely. Terms like this, you probably won't be surprised to learn that there isn't universal agreement about what neurodivergent means. But when people are talking about neurodiversity, usually what they're talking about is people who experience and perceive the world differently than the majority. So often neurodiversity is a sort of buzzword for autism or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But I've seen, definitions of neurodiversity that include Tourette syndrome, dyslexia, sensory processing disorder, and any number of other ways of perceiving the world and encoding information in the world that are different than the majority. And the reason this matters is that the world we raise children in is normed for the majority of people, right? So, when you get into an airplane, if you're really tall, your knees are on the seat in front of you because the measurement of the seats has been normed for the average height person. Well, the same thing is true for the sensory affordances of our spaces. What is comfortable for the majority of people may not be comfortable for somebody who is neurodivergent because they simply process input from the world in a different way.
Yeah, no, I love that analogy with height because I find that very applicable. I have a tall family and I understand that. So when we're talking about the majority, that's what we hear it called neurotypical, correct?
That's right. And I actually prefer to use the word neuromajority myself because it's a reminder that the world is normed for the majority of people. When we say neurotypical, often it's not accurately applied, right? Because I don't know if you're neurotypical, right? I don't know who is neurotypical. We just know that the majority are comfortable enough with the built environment to survive it, to sort of accommodate themselves to it, to, I don't know, think about this is a good example. I always think about the typical classroom chair, right? The majority of kids are right-handed. And you remember, if you're a lefty or all the lefties, remember how they have to look for that left-handed desk that supports their arm.
Right.
There's nothing quote unquote typical about right-handedness except that it's just more common. And that's why I think it's important, instead of saying neurotypical, sure, the typical person is typically, the majority, but there's nothing that's sort of normal or right or good about the characteristics they have in common. They're just common, right?
Right, right,
So that's why the built environment is structured to accommodate them. It's just that the attempt is to make as many people happy as possible, but it's going to leave some people out.
right, right. So in talking about the built environment, I firmly believe that we're operating in both online and offline space nearly equally at this point. And
Yeah.
is there a way that you see neuromajority versus neurodivergent kids interacting with screens and media?
Yes. There's a lot of research showing that neurodivergent kids, and most of this is on kids with autism diagnoses and or ADHD, um, interacting with media in ways that their parents find sort of remarkable. For example, being very attached to their media devices, to the point where parents might say, oh, my child is addicted to their media. Or they might say they watch the same show over and over and over. And when my students and I were trying to create a theory of media sensory curation, what we were trying to explain was these sort of attachments that even young children can develop to media that don't really make sense to adults. Because on our end, we think, well, I use media for information or for emotion, like I want to see a tearjerker or a comedy. Like I use media for relationship building, to talk with people I know. But all of those things have to be learned. And little kids, by age 2 can have these attachments to media that they haven't learned yet. They don't know how to make sense of the comedy and all. So how is that happening? How are they, getting attached to media? And one of the things we looked at in the research when we were doing background research to develop the theory was the unavoidable uh, the unavoidable issue that we kept coming up against with respect to neurodivergence was sensory difference. So, although not all neurodivergent kids have, sensory experiences that differ from the majority, it's very, very common for neurodivergent kids to experience the world in a different way than other people. So, for example, the lights that seem normal to the typical kid might be too bright to a
Mhm.
neurodivergent kid. Or, the sound of a loud restaurant might be just a little annoying to the average diner, but to the neurodivergent kid, it's just a cacophony and they can't stand it and they want to, go running. And so we started paying attention to some of the behaviors that neurodivergent kids, but also typical kids. Yeah, like you will also see this among typical kids. They would have these very strong preferences for certain media content, settings, peripherals, environments, like, absolutely needing to watch movies under a blanket, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or needing to have their, sometimes it's not sometimes it's not about reducing sensory input, but about magnifying it. So they like things really loud or really frenetic because it relieves, a sort of sensory boredom for them. So we started developing measurements of kids' different media behaviors and adult media behaviors as well. And this index of sensory curation was a way to measure how, I don't want to say picky, because it's not like a pickiness, but how particular people were about their media options, right? They have to have a certain kind of content. They have to see it over and over again. Do they have to have it at a certain setting? Do they need to have their media time? Do they get upset, if their media time is interrupted? And we found that these behaviors, which we call media sensory curation, correlated really highly with non-media sensory measures. So measures of just children having sort of sensory issues. They might be really hypersensitive to some
Mm-hmm.
kind of input, like light or sound is too, bright or loud, or they might be hyposensitive to certain kinds of input, where sounds that drive, their parents crazy are great for them, and they love to turn up those sounds. Um, And so it turns out that, we find that a certain portion, maybe about a third of, typically developing kids use media for this sort of sensory curation to help kind of regulate their sensory experience in environments that may otherwise be dysregulating. But when it comes to neurodivergent kids, in our research, mostly with autism and ADHD diagnoses, those kids, it was more like 45%. So
Oh,
yeah, they really use media to help manage their sensory regulation.
no, that's really validating, I think, to so much of what I've just experienced as a parent, you know? And we've got to take a little break, but next, let's explore this moderation of sensory input further. Gab Wireless now offers options. Wearable tech like the Gab Watch, devices like Gab phones, and even a kid safe, non explicit music library. Built on the most reliable wireless network in the country, Gab is a go to for first phones and safe tech. Get safety, peace of mind, and an added discount by using the code HSHabits at checkout. I'm speaking with Dr. Kris Harrison, who runs the FAM Lab. That's the Family and Media Laboratory at the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media, where she studies media content, its uses, and effects on children and families. So, Kris, you not only have a front row seat to the latest research surrounding neurodivergent kids and media, but a personal connection as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I was actually diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which used to be, under the autism spectrum, diagnostically in my 30s. I'm in my 50s now. And now there is no Asperger's syndrome anymore. It's just all autism spectrum disorders. As you can hear, obviously, I don't have any kind of communication impairment, but I do have three teenagers, two of whom also have autism spectrum diagnoses. And so I've been watching this, from a sort of front row view. And there's an expression among academic researchers, and that is research is me search. And we often are embarrassed to say it because sometimes, what you're researching is such an obvious reflection of who you are. But as a kid, I remember feeling like the world was just, a sensory hell because
Mm.
I was born at the end of the 1960s, and in the 70s, I wore itchy wool and I had to breathe cigarette smoke everywhere. And it just, I had two brothers and they were so loud. And then, anytime I would say, oh, I don't like this, it itches, it's uncomfortable, I got the pushback like, oh, stop being so sensitive. And I think we're living in a time now, thankfully, where people better understand that kids aren't making it up. They're
Right.
they're not doing this to be difficult, right? They really are uncomfortable. And let me give you an example. This is a great example of how my own imperfect parenting, just because I have a connection with neurodiversity doesn't mean that I do everything right myself. My daughter, who is on the autism spectrum, she is really sensitive to light. And I took her in to get her vision tested just for standard glasses. And the ophthalmologist looked at her in the dark and said, her pupils are huge. And I said, oh, well, it's dark in here. And she said, no, no, no. Like she just naturally has really big pupils. And I said, wait, you can have
Oh.
big pupils naturally? I thought everybody's pupils adjusted to light in the same way. And she said, no, no, no. And suddenly I just thought, my God, my poor kid, like she has huge pupils. I should have been putting, sunglasses on her since she was little. Like she structurally, her eyes let in more light than the typical person's eyes. And so imagine, having kids who are truly, honestly, genuinely, sincerely experiencing the world as more intense than you do and saying to them, oh, stop it, you're just being dramatic, right?
Right.
I
Right.
mean, that, of course, that's going to give rise to conflict with a child because they want so badly to be believed. And I think
Sure.
that this is where, the definition of sensory regulation is really helpful to people, because if you look at research on like occupational therapy, for example, sensory regulation is a really important concept there. And by sensory, here's what I mean. Like we're taught when we're young that there are five senses, right?
Uh-huh.
Sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. But there are actually a number more. For example, what has been called like the vestibular sensation is your sense of balance, right? If you're
For
dizzy, there's
sure.
disturbance in your vestibular sense. And then proprioceptive or proprioception,
Mm-hmm.
your sense of like where your body parts are in relation to each other. And when those things are upset or unbalanced, it's very hard for the child to kind of settle down into a state of calm alertness that they need to be in to learn, to function, to process information, to organize their day. So all humans have this sort of innate drive to kind of seek sensory regulation in our environments. How do I find a space of comfort? You can think of it as just sort of like a pleasant feeling of stasis, like just I'm here, I'm alert, I'm comfortable, I'm rested, I'm paying attention.
Yeah. And when you're in a state of dysregulation, your need to regulate is urgent.
Yes,
I mean, and it's overwhelming. I
yes,
mean, I would say it becomes the primary concern
that's right. It
of, and so
replaces
you're
everything else.
right, right. So, I mean, I'm just picturing a child in a classroom who may be experiencing what you're talking about, and they are going to be unable to focus on anything else because they need that feeling to stop.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so now imagine, that you are in a space that is really overwhelming from a sensory perspective. And research on the built environment shows that, for example, restaurants are getting louder. Um,
Sure, with all the
public,
hard spaces and echoing and yeah.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes, and public spaces are getting more visually cluttered with advertising
Mm-hmm.
all over the place. So the world is actually different from a sensory perspective now than it used to be. And so I think about this like, I'm too old to have had, a tablet or a smartphone when I was a kid. But if I had one of those things, you better believe I would have used it as a tool to help regulate my sensory input.
Right.
So if I'm in a really loud restaurant, if I can put on headphones and look at my tablet and play something like Minecraft, which has really predictable patterns, motion paths, it actually kind of pulls down my experience of sensory overload, and I can stay there. So one of the things we've told, parents is, especially at restaurants, we can be so judgmental of one another and of kids who are using devices at restaurants. But what if using that device is the thing that's enabling that kid to stay there and have lunch with their family?
Right. And maybe disengage for a minute and to
Yeah.
engage with their family and then go back into their safe spot or
Yes.
cocoon. So
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think we all need to just learn to suspend our judgment because we do not know what other people we do not sit in other people's chairs. We do not know what they are going through.
And I think with kids, this is especially important because adults decide where kids eat, sleep, learn, and play. And
Mhm.
when we outfit our home, we do it with an eye toward our own sensory experience. What is going to make us comfortable? And a lot of times that also makes our kids comfortable, but it doesn't always. And so they are from day one, they are always having to kind of, you know, find spaces and places and times and behaviors that they can do to kind of maintain regulation. And if we can understand what they need, and this is going to differ, by child.
For
Like my
sure.
two of my kids are twins, the two with the autism spectrum diagnoses, And I swear, he is hyposensitive where she is hypersensitive, and she's hyposensitive where he's hypersensitive. They're very different people. So if you can learn what helps each of them find that kind of sensory regulation, then what you can learn to do with your children is build spaces, even if it's just like a corner, a safe little corner, but build spaces and rituals that enable them to reach a state of sensory regulation without having to resort to screens.
Yes, and without having to resort to massive emotional outbursts to be heard,
Yes,
because you can give them the language that they need to communicate their own needs and be respected.
that's right. And
So you're really empowering kids by doing that.
well, that the goal is, we simply don't, like you said, giving them the language. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we have a very paltry sensory vocabulary in our culture, right? Like a lot of people will be like, oh, what's proprioception? Right? Or
Right.
what's the vestibular sense? And then, of course, when you explain it, they say, oh, yeah, I get that. But we just don't talk about it. And so you would never expect somebody to have that level of self-awareness to say, you know what, mom, I don't like the proprioceptive input here. Or, mom, I really need some proprioceptive input. Can we find some monkey bars for me to climb? They don't know how to articulate that. And so it's something feels good or it doesn't feel good. And what we found in some of our research was with some of these kids, when their parents, say, you have to get off the screen right now. Um, if if that child is pretty regulated and comfortable and has other spaces where they can be regulated and comfortable, it's not a big deal. But if this is the only space that that child can find some kind of comfort, calmness, and regulation, and the parent now says you have to leave that and come back into, this busy dinner party that we're hosting, and you have to come in the kitchen and let relatives hug you and do all that stuff. Sometimes they lose their temper because
Sure.
they're being asked to move into a state that for them might actually be painful.
Right, right. So, and this is a huge challenge that I think parents of both neuromajority and neurodivergent children have.
Yeah.
But I think because of all the things that we've just talked about, the parents of neurodivergent kids are often, raising their hands first at presentations and healthy screen habits
Yeah.
events, asking asking for this type of like tool set of how can we deal with the transitioning off of a screen. Do you have any suggestions on how to reduce that conflict?
So I struggle with the same thing in my own home, knowing this, at a theoretical level and applying it at a practical personal level are two different things, right?
Totally.
Um,
Well,
and it all,
I can tell you how to eat a healthy diet all day long, and just don't follow me around and see what I actually put in my mouth. So there you go.
I actually think the food analogy is a really, really good one because um, media are an inevitable part of daily life now, just like food is an inevitable part of daily life. And if you're looking for a way to have this sort of balance, um, that's really what regulation means, right? Is balance. And so part of it is if we approach this with not so much with an authoritarian perspective of I am the parent and you must get off now, but um, more of the perspective of the sort of authoritative teacher with your children. What you're teaching them to do is you're trying to teach them another sense that's been called interoception. So interoception is our awareness of what our bodies need at any given moment, of how our bodies are feeling. So interoceptive
Okay.
awareness with eating, for example, is checking in with yourself to ask, am I really hungry right now, or am I just bored? Or am I
Mhm.
really hungry, or am I thirsty? Or am I tired? Do I just need to go to bed? Something similar goes on, or we need to be doing something similar, I think, with media, right? So, hey, honey, you've got some homework to do. We talked about, how you can sort of structure your days to do a little homework every night. What time tonight do you think you want to be working on that homework. And obviously this gets a little easier as they're older and they
Sure.
have
Sure.
some buy-in, right? Like they do want to do well in school, or
Sure.
they have goals they want to meet. They don't want to spend their whole life in front of a screen. And then you can say, well, how can we set that up? Like, what would be a comfortable homework space for you? Um, and then, when it's time for them to get off, we give them the little warning. Okay, about 10 minutes, you've got, or we set an alarm for them or whatever's going to help them. But ultimately, we keep bringing it back around to, oh, honey, remember this is what you wanted. You wanted to do this. Remember, we set up this space and you wanted to do it. And kind of teaching them to go, okay, I guess I've had enough of this now. Now I'm going to do this other thing that's going to meet a goal of mine. But it's always about their desire to meet their goals. And they're allowed to enjoy themselves a little and
Yeah.
with some screen time. But, just like you don't let them eat cake all the time, I am not suggesting that you let them spend all day on screens. And I've actually talked to some autistic adults who've said things like, how do you handle the guilt? And I said, what guilt? And they said that the feeling of guilt over spending my entire youth in front of screens. And I said, well, what were your other options? And they didn't have other places where they felt safe and comfortable and regulated. So if they
Mm.
don't have those other options, they're going to come back to screens because they're able to choose the content that regulates their sensory input
Mm-hmm.
to a level that's comfortable. They're going to be able to choose the environment. Like, you can modify screen media in so many different ways to support your regulation, but you can't do that easily to your non-media environment. You have to actually put in the work to kind of structure non-media environments and rituals to be gratifying in a sensory way on their own without the screens.
Yeah. And I think it's going to take probably a little bit of experimentation
Yes.
by, parents are going to need to be able to hopefully live through the
Yeah.
discomfort of
Yeah.
finding out what works, because finding out what works is going to hold hands with finding out what doesn't work.
That's exactly right. I mean, I am
So,
I'm definitely not saying like, oh, I have a magic potion for this, right? But pay attention to your kid from a sensory perspective and say, okay, what is this kid seeking? And I'll give you an example. My daughter, when she was about 3 or 4, she used to try to pull herself up on the towel bar in the bathroom, like trying to do pull-ups on the towel bar. And I had learned recently about proprioception. I thought this kid really needs proprioceptive input. So, and vestibular, because she loved to spin. So
uh-huh.
we ended up, now, of course, you have to have the space to be able to do this, which I know is not available to everybody, but we installed a hook in our living room and hung like a trapeze bar from it. And then she could pull up on it, swing on it, spin on it. And that helped her, meet that need for vestibular and proprioceptive input without, having to run around with a tablet and the music,
Yeah.
really loud, which is what she was doing before, and it was driving everybody crazy. But, if you have access to outdoors, outside used to be that space where pretty much everybody could find a place that would either be calm and quiet or loud and exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of limits on where and when kids can go outside now. And so for
Exactly.
those reasons that they're also turning to screens. So
Yeah.
yeah, we just need to work with them to figure out what non-screen options are alternatives. And that's really what I come down to is it's not that screens are all bad, but your kid is going to be using screens a lot if they don't feel they have any other alternative to find a space of sort of calm alertness that comes from
Mm.
sensory regulation.
Mm-hmm. So much to digest. So when we come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Kris Harrison for her healthy screen habit. Did you know that Healthy Screen Habits does workshops? For 2 days, we can come and guide students through an exploration of their own tech use and facilitate a research-based presentation bespoke to their own questions. 87.5% of the teens who participated in this workshop recorded a change in their tech use following participation. For more information, contact us at info@healthyscreenhabits.org. We're back. I'm talking with Dr. Kris Harrison about neurodivergent kids and screen habits. Now, on every episode of the Healthy Screen Habits podcast, I ask each guest for a healthy screen habit. This is a tip or takeaway that our listeners can put into practice in their own home. Kris, do you have one?
Yes, I would say my healthy screen habit is to work with your child to identify and or construct spaces and rituals and activities that help that child reach a state of sensory regulation without screens. This doesn't mean that they're going to stop using screens, but it does mean that they'll have alternatives so that the screen won't be the default place to go to feel calm and alert and centered.
Excellent. As always, you can find a complete transcript of this show by going to healthyscreenhabits.org, click the podcast button, and scroll down to find this episode. Kris, thank you so much for taking the time to share a bit of yourself, your story, your research, and mostly thank you for lending your voice to helping all of us understand how to make the world just a softer place for all developing minds.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Hillary. It was fun.
For more information, you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Healthy Screen Habits. Make sure to visit our website, healthyscreenhabits.org, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or via RSS, so you'll never miss an episode. It's free, it's fun, and you get a healthy new screen habit each week. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate you giving us a quick rating. It really does help other people find us and spread the word of healthy screen habits. Or if you'd simply like to tell a friend, we'd love that too. I so appreciate you spending your time with me this week, and I look forward to learning more healthy habits together.